People have used various substances in the hope of reducing physical pain or altering states of consciousness for centuries. Around the world, almost all people use one or more substances that affect the central nervous system, relieving physical and mental anguish or producing euphoria. Despite the often devastating consequences of taking such substances into the body, their initial effects are usually pleasing, a factor that is at the root of substance use disorders. The United States is a drug culture. Americans use drugs to wake up, to stay alert throughout the day, to relax, and to reduce pain. The widespread availability and frequent use of various drugs sets the stage for potential abuse of drugs. The DSM-5 contains substance use disorder categories for specific substances, including alcohol, amphetamines, cannabis, cocaine, hallucinogens, inhalants, opioids, phenylcyclidine, sedatives, hypnotics, anxiolytics, and tobacco. New to the DSM-5 is the inclusion of gambling disorder in the chapter on substance use and addictive disorders. This category was in the impulse control disorders not elsewhere classified section of the DSM-4 TR. Drug and alcohol use disorders are among the most stigmatized of disorders. Terms such as addict or alcoholic are tossed about carelessly, as if these words capture the essence of people, not the disorder that they suffer from. Historically, drug and alcohol problems have been viewed as moral lapses rather than conditions in need of treatment. Unfortunately, such attitudes persist today. Yet there is convincing evidence that becoming physiologically dependent on drugs or alcohol is not, in fact, only a matter of personal choice. True, people make decisions about whether or not to try alcohol or other drugs, but the ways in which these decisions and the substances involved interact with an individual's neurobiology, social setting, culture, and other environmental factors all conspire to create dependence. Such factors put some people at higher risk for substance dependence than others. It is a mistake to consider substance use disorders as somehow solely the result of moral failing or personal choice. But it is also a mistake to consider those dependent on drugs or alcohol as being without recourse to change the course of their disorder. Treatment and behavioral change can work in much the same way that they can work for diseases such as diabetes, where people can change the course of their disease with insulin and diet control. Prior to the DSM-5, the pathological use of substances fell into two categories: substance abuse and substance dependence. However, reviews of the research literature in preparation for the DSM-5 pointed to several problems with this two-category distinction. First, the reliability of the substance abuse category was poor. Second, most people who meet criteria for abuse, particularly for alcohol, do not go on to develop dependence as was originally believed. Third, analyses of the DSM criteria indicated that they represent one and not two distinct categories. The term addiction typically refers to a more severe substance use disorder that is characterized by having more symptoms, tolerance, and withdrawal, by using more of the substance than intended, by trying unsuccessfully to stop, by having physical or psychological problems made worse by the drug, and by experiencing problems at work or with friends. In the DSM-5, meeting 6 or more of the diagnostic criteria is considered severe substance use disorder.
Substance-related disorders arise when psychoactive substances are used excessively. The term addiction is used when there is compulsive drug-seeking behavior and loss of control over drug use. Also, withdrawal symptoms occur when use is stopped, and withdrawal symptoms can be quite severe. I don't think I've ever quoted Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones in a lecture before, but he said it well when talking about withdrawal. He said, "I only get ill when I give up drugs." Loss of control is a major sign of addiction. For example, a businessman may stop at a bar after work for a drink or two and sincerely intend to limit himself to 2 drinks, but he ends up leaving at 2 a.m. It's as if the shutoff switch has broken. Loss of control is perplexing, as sometimes individuals can control their use, but overall, use is unpredictable. All drugs of abuse target the brain's pleasure center. All drugs of abuse directly activate the brain's reward systems by flooding its circuits with dopamine. This flood of dopamine creates the euphoric effects that lead abusers to repeat the behavior in order to repeat the experience. Drugs are more addictive than the natural highs produced by other things we like, such as eating, listening to music, or having sex, because the drugs cause far more dopamine to be released, anywhere from between 2 and 10 times as much. Now, this flood of dopamine results in an eventual dopamine depletion. Research has focused on the dopamine pathways to provide an explanation for compulsive drug-seeking behavior and the physiological dependence on substances of abuse. Over time, the neurons in the dopamine pathways downregulate in response to surges in dopamine, meaning they produce less dopamine, or they reduce the number of dopamine receptors. Users then need to take drugs to raise the dopamine levels back to normal and deal with withdrawal. In order to experience the effects initially experienced from the drugs, they need to take higher and higher doses, which is called tolerance. Classical conditioning and having a predisposition have also provided some explanations of substance use disorders. Because users associate the pleasurable feelings of using the drug with the cues in the environment that were there when they took the drug, they develop classically conditioned responses that maintain an addiction. They're associated with cravings. For example, I had a client who had stopped drinking but had persistent cravings. They simply wouldn't go away, and we were perplexed. Finally, I had him describe what he did during the day. We found out that every day he drove home from work, he followed the same route, passing a bar he used to frequent. He would see the brightly lit neon signs every day on his way home from work. These signs triggered the cravings because they were associated with the good feelings produced by drinking. He decided to change his route home, and the cravings subsided. Some individuals may have impairments in brain mechanisms controlling inhibition, leading to lower levels of self-control, and thus these individuals may be predisposed to substance use disorders.
In the DSM-5, substance use disorders are differentiated according to the specific substance used, such as alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, inhalant use disorder, or opioid use disorder. Now, Dr. Francis recommends continuing to use the distinctions between dependence and abuse, and he points out 3 distinct disadvantages to a lack of diagnostic differentiation between the two. As I previously mentioned, the term addiction is used very loosely. The lack of distinction seriously affects treatment and can send the wrong message. Individuals receive a diagnosis of a substance use disorder based on meeting 2 or more symptoms and then rated on the level of severity. For example, it's considered mild if 2 or 3 of the designated symptoms are present, moderate if 4 or 5 are present, and if 6 or more symptoms are present, this indicates a severe disorder. If there is dependence, then the DSM-5 allows the clinician to add a specifier indicating physiological dependence.
Here's the list of the DSM-5 criteria for a substance use disorder, which can also be found in your text. These symptoms are assessed in screening instruments. And for example, you can see loss of control here, where the quantity of the substance used or the amount of time spent using is often greater than intended. and you can see it here. Use of the substance continues despite harmful effects, and loss of control is here. Continued substance use occurs even when the substance is causing physical or psychological problems. The physiological symptoms show up here, intolerance, and also here, where withdrawal symptoms may precipitate resumption of use, and substances may be used to relieve or avoid withdrawal symptoms.
We'll take a look at some of the substances associated with abuse, which include prescription medications, which are used to treat anxiety, insomnia, or pain. More recently, opiates legally prescribed as pain medications, including hydrocodone and oxycodone, have become drugs of abuse. Hydrocodone is most often combined with other drugs such as acetaminophen, the active agent in Tylenol, to create prescription pain medications such as Vicodin, Zydone, or Loratat. Oxycodone is found in medicines such as Percodan, Tylox, and OxyContin. Vicodin is one of the most commonly abused drugs containing hydrocodone, and OxyContin is one of the most commonly abused drugs containing oxycodone. The illicit supply seems to come largely from prescriptions that are forged, stolen, or diverted to dealers on the black market. As prescribed, OxyContin comes in a pill form with a polymer coating. Unfortunately, the pills can easily be dissolved into a form that can then be injected or snorted. Legal substances associated with abuse include alcohol, caffeine, tobacco, and household chemicals, which can be huffed. And illegal substances include methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin.
Alcohol fits into the category of legal substances, and it is important to note that it is a depressant. Depressants cause the nervous system to slow down. Even though many don't like the taste, they still drink alcohol to relax. Drinking can be defined by the amount used. Moderate drinking is a lower risk pattern of drinking, no more than 1 drink for women or 2 drinks for men per day. Heavy drinking, the drinking levels exceed the moderate level, of course, and binge drinking is defined as 4 to 5 drinks or more on a single occasion. Women tend to become addicted to alcohol quicker and easier than men because their bodies contain less water and more fatty tissue. Also, there is less activity of the enzyme that breaks down alcohol. So 1 drink for a woman has the impact of 2 drinks for a man. The effects of alcohol abuse can be quite severe. Alcohol poisoning can occur. Alcohol has a chemical structure very close to that of ether, and at higher and higher doses, it eventually affects the autonomic nervous system and can result in impaired breathing, coma, and eventually death. Alcohol use disorder is twice as likely in men, but as I mentioned earlier, alcoholism progresses more quickly in women. Delirium tremens is a serious withdrawal symptom which is life-threatening. This can result in seizures, agitation, and hallucinations. Someone can die from alcohol withdrawal. One cannot die from heroin withdrawal, although they look quite terrible and they look as if they're going to die. But alcohol withdrawal is a medical emergency in some cases. Let's take a look at some other substances of abuse. The opioids are pain-killing agents that depress the central nervous system. Illegal forms are heroin and opium. Prescription pain relievers such as morphine, codeine, and oxycodone are also opioids. Opioids are highly addictive and produce both euphoria and drowsiness. And research indicates that many opioid abusers began their habit with prescribed opioids, eventually buying prescription opioids illegally or trying heroin as a less expensive and even more lethal opioid. Someone may be diagnosed with sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytic use disorder. These drugs have calming effects, and they're prescribed to treat agitation, muscle tension, insomnia, and anxiety. Hypnotics are referred to medications used to induce sleep. Anxiolytics refer to medications that reduce anxiety. The benzodiazepines such as Valium and Xanax produce rapid anxiolytic effects in moderate doses, but they produce hypnotic effects in higher doses. And benzodiazepines are sometimes used to treat alcohol withdrawal. Now, sleeping medications disrupt the normal sleep cycle, making them difficult to get off of, and they can be highly addictive. We don't often think of caffeine as a substance of abuse. It is a stimulant found in coffee, chocolate, tea, and soft drinks. It is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in the world. In North America, 90% of adults use caffeine daily, and it has withdrawal symptoms, and one can be diagnosed with caffeine withdrawal. These symptoms include headache, fatigue, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. Another substance of abuse is cocaine. Crack is a potent form of cocaine that is typically smoked. Because of its potency and the route of administration, it produces immediate but short-lived effects. Cocaine withdrawal produces lethargy and depression. Now, one rule of thumb is that the withdrawal syndrome is usually the opposite of the substance's effects. And individuals who use cocaine often have a shortened lifespan. Cannabis is the botanical name for a plant that contains the chemical THC. THC is fat soluble, so it stays in the body for a relatively long time, and it can be detected in urine for even a month. THC can produce stimulant, depressant, and hallucinogenic effects, and the growing conditions affect the THC content. And marijuana is derived from leaves and flowers. Marijuana is the most commonly used illicit drug worldwide. 20 million adults and adolescents report current use, and males are more likely to use. Dependence produces a pervasive lack of concern over consequences, and also something called amotivational syndrome, or a lack of goal-directed behavior has been observed. Marijuana use does produce withdrawal symptoms, and I want to comment a little bit on the protracted use of marijuana. I do not believe that marijuana is a harmless drug. The THC in marijuana is just one of the hundreds of chemicals in marijuana. THC is stored in fat cells. The highest concentration of fat cells in the body are in the brain and in the genitals. When one ingests THC, that chemical remains in the brain and genitals stored in fat cells for some time. As I mentioned, THC is fat soluble. THC coats the cells of the brain and can interfere with the transmission of neural impulses. The ingestion of marijuana slows down these electrical impulses from one cell to another. So response time is slowed. Perceptions are altered. In fact, marijuana is classified as a hallucinogen due to this altered perception. Marijuana has been classified as a Schedule I drug by the FDA as one of the most dangerous drugs with a high potential for abuse and dependence. Other drugs in Schedule I are heroin, LSD, and ecstasy. A problem occurs with protracted use of marijuana, especially among teenagers who have a prefrontal cortex that has not fully developed. Use can be harmful in terms of the development of one's neural architecture. The prefrontal cortex is an important area for judgment and decision making. And this development is hampered because brain cells are coated and cannot function or develop properly. There can be long-term consequences even if one stops using marijuana. So I find one hard-pressed to say that marijuana is a safe drug. Just as excessive use of alcohol damages the brain, excessive use of marijuana can have dire consequences. We know a lot more about the effects of marijuana than we did in the 60s and 70s. And we know protracted use of marijuana has damaging and sometimes permanent effects on one's brain development and even sexual development and sexual performance. Now, sometimes people combine substances, and a serious danger lies in something called the synergistic effect. Interactions between substances intensifies effects. It is not an additive effect. In other words, 1 plus 1 does not equal 2. There's actually a multiplying effect or an exponential effect, as you can see in this equation. This leads to lethal overdoses. Some dangerous combinations are alcohol and tranquilizers, stimulants and sleeping pills, and alcohol and energy drinks. The FDA actually banned pre-mixed flavored alcohol energy drinks, saying the combination of caffeine and alcohol poses a public health hazard because high levels of caffeine mixed with alcohol masks the cues of intoxication. We still have much to learn about the etiology of substance use disorders, but a typical progression from substance use to abuse starts with a decision to experiment with drugs. Then the drug begins to serve important purpose. Consumption continues. There can be an obsession with using substances at this point. Then brain chemistry becomes altered from chronic use. This results in physiological dependence, withdrawal symptoms, and cravings. And finally, lifestyle changes occur due to chronic abuse. Individuals plan their day around obtaining, using, and recovering from the use of substances. The major motive for substance use is coping with psychological distress and emotional symptoms. 45% of abusers have concurrent psychiatric disorders. One trait that is associated with substance use problems that appears to be emerging is called behavioral under control. It's a personality characteristic associated with rebelliousness, impulsivity, and risk-taking. It is important to note that research has been looking for the addictive personality type or the alcoholic personality, and there's no such thing. Addiction is simply an equal opportunity destroyer of lives. Let's move on to look briefly at treatment for substance use disorders. 22 million people had a substance use disorder in 2012, and only 4 million are receiving treatment. And that is a sobering statistic, to say the least. Cost is a significant barrier for some. Managed care limits the days of treatment, and the days of the 28-day rehab seem long gone to me, except for the rich and for the famous. Treatment occurs in supportive intervention settings, self-help groups, mental health clinics, and inpatient and outpatient treatment centers. Treatment for substance use disorders is most effective when incorporating best practices from high-quality addiction research. And research shows motivational enhancement therapy can be integrated with CBT and is one of the most effective short-term therapy approaches. There is a video in this unit explaining this approach, which addresses ambivalence about giving up substance use. Be aware of the appropriate medication to use for specific substance use disorders, such as antabuse or naltrexone for alcoholism and methadone for opioid addiction. And treatment basically has two phases. First, detoxification, and the second phase is preventing relapse. Unfortunately, relapse rates for people in treatment are high. Many people find participating in Alcoholics Anonymous an effective way to recover from alcohol use disorder. AA regards alcoholism as a disease and advocates total abstinence. Its philosophy is based on the disease model, which says some people will lose all control over drinking once they take the first drink. Therefore, since alcoholism is a chronic, progressive, and fatal disease, the only way to recover is to abstain completely. AA prescribes 12 steps that people must take toward recovery. AA groups provide moral and social support, and members make themselves available to each other in times of crisis. Another idea is called controlled drinking. The idea here is that under the right conditions, people can learn to limit their drinking. The trick is to determine which individuals this might work for. Otherwise, you are courting disaster. The bottom line in the treatment for alcohol use disorder is more research on treatments is needed.
There's only one disorder included in this section of the DSM-5 involving behavioral conditions that do not involve the ingestion of substances, and that is gambling disorder. This is considered a process addiction. A process addiction is an addiction to an activity or process, such as eating, spending money, or gambling. These behaviors can be as debilitating as those associated with substance addictions, and they require psychological treatment. People sometimes have difficulty understanding these conditions because they believe that people should just be able to stop negative behavior. But process addicts face the same problems that people with substance addictions do. Just like a substance addiction, a process addiction usually starts out small, and people who suffer from such addictions may have an illusion of self-control. It can also be very harmful. Chronic gambling and spending, for example, can bankrupt someone in addition to generating large amounts of debt. Now, you do want to consider a differential diagnosis of perhaps a manic episode where a loss of judgment and excessive gambling may occur, or even a personality disorder. Problems with gambling may occur in individuals with antisocial personality disorder and other personality disorders.
In treating gambling disorder, therapists should be aware that distortions in thinking may be present. Many with this disorder believe that money is both the cause and the solution to their problems, and they tend to chase their losses, not understanding the objective probability of winning. They may think that the longer their losing streak is, the closer they are to winning, which is called the gambler's fallacy. Individuals with gambling disorder have high rates of other mental disorders such as substance use disorders, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and personality disorders. And men are more likely to develop this disorder. Finally, up to half of the people in treatment for this disorder report suicidal ideation, and about 17% have attempted suicide.